Welcome back, Snappers. Today's video will cover a fantastic deck that guarantees you some gnarly games. If you enjoy controlling the game from start to finish, countering your opponent's plays, and big cube wins, then this deck is for you. I came up with this deck after some experimenting and found that it did really well with a 58% win rate peak. It also has an answer for most of the current meta, which makes it a good candidate as a deck that can get you to infinite. I'm going to run you through every single card in this deck, how to pilot the deck, and exactly what your game plan and strategy should be when playing Nebula Control. So, let's get into it. Let me start off by explaining the purpose behind every card in my Nebula Control deck. First of all, the star of this deck is obviously Nebula, and I wanted to showcase her strength as a card that can rally tons of power into the late game. Part of why Nebula is so strong is because of her propensity to force your opponent to play on the same location to prevent her from gaining more power every turn. This is really important for us because it means we know where the opponent will be playing. Nebula also makes your opponent play their weaker early cards on her location. Usually, people have their own game plan, but that goes to the wind as soon as Nebula is played because she cannot be allowed to gain power. Nebula serves as a big distraction for your turn 3 through turn 5 plays, which we will get into later in the video. Suffice it to say that she is a crucial card for this deck, so if you don't have her, I recommend you get her as soon as you can. The second card in the deck is Daredevil. Daredevil guarantees you that you know where your opponent plays on turn 5, which when paired with Professor X essentially guarantees you lock down and win a location. Daredevil also synergizes really well with Gamora, Enchantress, and Green Goblin. Predicting your opponent's plays and where they will play is what this deck is all about, so Daredevil makes for another great addition, but can be replaced by Lizard if you don't have him. Armor is our third card in this deck and serves as a counter to destroy decks and as protection for Nebula in case Killmonger shows up. Armor is a 2-cost 3-power card, so it's also not a bad turn 2 play. That's pretty much it for Armor. She's sort of essential to this deck because as Nebula gets more popular, and she will, you're going to see a lot more Killmonger. We already see him a lot because of Sarah Control's prevalence in the meta as the best deck to play, period. Scarlet Witch is the next card, and she serves as a location disruptor if you find that your opponent will benefit too much from a certain location. For example, if Onslaught Citadel pops up and you know they are playing a Patriot deck. Scarlet is also useful on the flip side, if you have a poor location that disrupts your play like the Nexus, which doesn't suit this deck as you don't have reliable high power. Rather, this deck's main role is to limit where your opponent can play. That's why Scarlet is a good pick for this deck. You could replace her with Magic solely to extend the game a bit, but I don't really have a better alternative for her. Sentinel is our fifth card for this deck and is just a great card. Sentinel gives you another copy of himself every time you play him, which guarantees a solid 2-cost card to play whenever you want. He is great with Storm because he adds a good amount of power to Storm's flooded location, which helps you win the location later in the game once turn 6 comes around. Our sixth card is Green Goblin. Green Goblin is our part-time Galactus counter and part-time location chaos agent. If you know where your opponent will play, you can try to fill their location with Green Goblin to prevent them from playing more cards there. He also synergizes really well with power-reducing locations like Negative Zone. I've also found him to be a good card to have in hand when your opponent plays Scorpion, as he benefits from the power reduction. If you don't have Green Goblin, a suitable replacement could be Goose as another Galactus counter, or even Mojo. Mojo is a card that synergizes well with Nebula, as normally people don't want to play where Mojo is, so you can double down on Nebula and force them to play on Mojo, or even force them to avoid playing on Mojo, which would benefit Nebula. Either way, you benefit from this because your opponent is between a rock and a hard place now. Storm is our seventh card and is a crucial part of this deck. She allows you to lock up a location, preferably Nebula's location, due to her obvious synergy. If you can lock up Nebula's location, she will gain power. Storm also allows you to bamboozle your opponent into not playing on other locations and sets up an easy Spider-Man into Professor X combo, which almost guarantees you a win of at least one location. The whole idea behind how you should play Storm is to lock down Nebula's location to allow her to build power. Usually, I will play Storm on turn 3, which makes turn 4 the last time a card can be played there. This will usually force your opponent to play a card on Nebula to avoid both her building power and to avoid losing out on winning that location. I often will allow them to play a card into the flooding zone and will instead play Spider-Man on another location to lock it up and play Professor X on turn 5. Your goal is to make your opponent think they are winning. Even if they do win the flooded location, it doesn't really matter because Dr. Doom is your turn 6 win condition that effectively will win back that losing flooded location. I briefly talked about Spider-Man already, but he is an underrated card in my opinion, and serves a multifunctional role as a Galactus counter, a combo card with Professor X, and can even single-handedly win you a game if your opponent has filled up 2 other locations. The optimal path to success with Spider-Man is that you have hopefully locked down another location with Storm, and can now play him on a separate location to prevent your opponent from adding more cards, and then playing Professor X on turn 5. I've found him to be really good into on reveal decks, where your opponent will usually play Wong on turn 4, which makes Spider-Man a good card to play on turn 5 to prevent an Odin Wombo combo. Spider-Man is versatile and relies heavily on your own knowledge of other decks. If you can successfully sniff out what your opponent is playing, Spider-Man can force them to play where they don't want to. Our 9th card is perhaps my favorite card in this deck, and she is Enchantress. She recently got a buff and is now an insane turn 4 counter to ongoing decks, Patriot decks, Devil Dinosaur, and Darkhawk. Basically, whenever you see an ongoing card in play, Enchantress is your best bet. Knocking out a Patriot feels so good and is the worst thing that can happen to your opponent. There's almost no better feeling than playing Enchantress on turn 6 to knock out all your opponent's ongoing cards in one go. She can and will win you games in one turn. She will make people retreat faster than you can imagine and is extremely tilting to be countered by from personal experience. She is, in my opinion, the strongest 4-cost card in the game currently. Card number 10 is our big baldy Professor X. The Professor is a decent Galactus counter, move deck counter, as well as a destroy deck counter. You can use him to win against Galactus if you know how to predict when Galactus will be played. Usually you can expect Galactus to be played when Wave is played on turn 3, followed by a likely snap. It's absolutely electrifying to predict a Galactus with Professor X. If you successfully do this, you have yourself a guaranteed win by 1 point. This will likely not happen frequently, so Professor X will usually be played on turn 5 after Spider-Man to lock up a location and win it at the same time. You can also play Professor X into a losing lane to lock up your opponent's destroy cards. If you expect a big turn 6 destroy combo, then playing Professor X on their Wolverine, Deadpool, or Sabretooth is a good play, even if it loses you that lane. He even is a good counter against Wong. Gamora is our 11th card. She represents a big turn 5 power boost and synergizes really well with Daredevil, guaranteeing you her full 12 power. She's here to counter any big cards your opponent will play on turn 5 with similar power. Gamora is one of the highest powered 5-cost cards available, which makes her a serious threat on the board. Finally, we have our ace in the hole, Dr. Doom. Dr. Doom is played to add power to Storm's flooded location for a turn 6 flip, and to hard to reach places like Sanctum Sanctorum, Kiln, and Morag. People usually do not expect him, and he easily wins matchups against most decks that can't add cards to lockdown locations. Now that we've talked about each card, let's discuss exactly how to pilot this deck turn by turn. Hopefully, your starting hand includes Nebula and Daredevil, as well as either Storm, Armor, or Dr. Doom. A hand like this is a good indication you should snap in later turns. Nebula should be your turn 1 play and should be played on a location that negatively impacts your opponent. For example, if the turn 1 revealed location is a power boosting location, you would not want to play her there, but rather on one of the other 2 undisclosed locations. Nebula works really well on locations like Negative Zone or any location that adds a debuff or a negative effect. The goal with Nebula is to force your opponent to play away from beneficial locations. If you don't have Nebula turn 1, you are forced to skip the turn, which isn't all that bad. Turn 2 is very important, so be sure to consider what your opponent is playing as well as what cards you can play by turn 6. On turn 2, you should play either Armor on Nebula to prevent Killmonger from ruining your day, or if you don't have Armor, then Daredevil should be played, but not on Nebula's location. This is to ensure you can fill Nebula's location with Storm, another card, and a Doombot by turn 6. This is the optimal play to make, but if you don't have Daredevil, then playing Sentinel on another location is a good idea. Additionally, you could also play Scarlet Witch if you would like to counter your opponent's plays on a separate location. These previous tactics assume that you have Storm in your hand and can play her on turn 3. If you don't have Storm, Armor, or Daredevil in your hand, then you should play either Sentinel on Nebula's location or skip the turn, saving your Scarlet Witch as an option to change another location. Like I said before, turn 2 is pretty crucial, and the goal should be to preemptively counter Killmonger via Armor, play Daredevil on a separate location from Nebula, or to preemptively add some power to another location with Sentinel. However, if you have Spider-Man, Professor X, and Storm in your hand, you should play a card on Nebula since you effectively have a win condition on at least one lane by end of turn 5 via Professor Baldi. So, let's say you pulled the optimal hand and have played Nebula turn 1 followed by Armor or Daredevil on turn 2. Turn 3 is when Storm is played on Nebula. The goal with this play is to force your opponent to add cards to win the flooded location while you play Spider-Man elsewhere, guaranteeing your lockdown with Professor X. Not playing into flooded is typically fine since Nebula will gain 4 points on turns 5 and 6. But what do you play if you don't have Storm? Well, you're going to want to play Green Goblin on Nebula or on an empty location if you think they are playing Galactus. This ensures that you maintain an advantage on at least one lane while you play your Spider-Man Professor X combo elsewhere. While your opponent is concerned with playing into Flooded to make sure they win that location, you will be playing Spider-Man on a separate location to set up your Professor X. This is a pretty great bamboozle that people don't expect and ensures that you win at least one location by turn 6 so you can flood the other locations with Doombots on turn 6. If you don't have Spider-Man, no worries. You can still lock down a lane on turn 5 and win it using Professor X alongside Daredevil. You can also play Enchantress on turn 4 to counter any ongoing cards your opponent has on the board. Big hits will be on Patriot or Zabu. However, if you are reasonably sure they are having more ongoing cards to play, such as if they are playing an ongoing deck, I would save Enchantress for turn 5 or 6 for a surprise counter on their ongoing cards. You only have 2 4-cost cards in this deck, so having a card to play on turn 4 is really crucial to set yourself up for success. If you haven't drawn any 4-cost cards, you should consider retreating at this point. Don't feel bad about retreating, as it's a core mechanic in this game to make sure your average cube rate stays consistent. Turn 5 is when you play Professor X, assuming you've played Spider-Man or Daredevil previously. If you played Spider-Man, then Professor X should be played on the same location, assuming that you are winning it. If you did not play Spider-Man on turn 4 but have Daredevil's ability active, then you should try to lock down a winning location wherever you can while anticipating your turn 6 Dr. Doom play or what other cards you may have for turn 6. If you don't have Professor X available to play, then Gamora should be your turn 5 play and should be played wherever your opponent will play, which should be easy assuming you have Daredevil on the board already. At this point, it becomes pretty obvious if you will win because you should be winning your Flooded location and should have another winning location due to Professor X or Gamora. It's now time to snap. If you didn't play Spider-Man on turn 4, then playing him on turn 5 on a winning location can win you the game simply because he will prevent your opponent from flipping one of your locations into their favor. Spider-Man also acts as a decent Galactus counter. Turn 6 is pretty obvious, as this is when you'll want to play Dr. Doom to ensure you flip the flooded location in your favor if you are losing it. Dr. Doom is here to ensure you maintain a lead in flooded if your opponent has the capability to also add cards to that location. If you don't have Doom, then you likely should retreat. Let's talk strategy briefly. This deck is all about controlling the outcome of the game by pushing your opponent to play on certain locations, while you sneakily play on another to flip the board in your favor. You have a lot of great counter cards to a lot of the meta. Cards like Spider-Man for turn 4 or turn 5 preventive plays, Professor X for the Galactus decks and infrequent move decks, but he can also work well against destroy decks alongside armor. You also have Enchantress to counter any Patriot and ongoing decks. My previous turn-by-turn analysis is a really good start, but remember that you also have to learn this deck by playing it. There are other ways of playing this deck that are a lot more reactionary, meaning that you will play your cards differently based on the locations that pop up or the cards that your opponent is playing. The main goal while playing this deck is to always keep an eye out for what your opponent's priorities are and what cards they will likely play based on your guess at their deck type. This is a type of strategy that will have to be fostered and learned by playing the game more and more and is a lot like instinct. This isn't something that can be taught well, but rather relies on your own game experience. So get out there and practice. For example, I have almost 300 games with this deck, which has allowed me to experience almost every type of matchup I will have. This is experience that is required when playing any type of deck, because only then will you be able to play purely in a reactionary way, which is the best way of playing this game in my opinion. When piloting this deck, you should attempt to disrupt and throw wrenches into your opponent's plans. You can do this by easily locking down locations with Storm and Professor X, as well as nixing any enemy ongoing cards with Enchantress. Green Goblin should be used to counter Galactus, but also to fill enemy locations that you believe they will be playing cards on. This deck excels when you play a turn ahead of your opponent using cards like Storm and Spider-Man. I wanted to quickly summarize a list of bad matchups that should be avoided. While we do have counters for him, Galactus is typically a bad matchup due to the likelihood that you don't pull into the cards you need to counter him. Other poor matchups are decks with Cosmo, as you do have a few on-reveal cards that are crucial to playing. Discard decks are also pretty poor matchups due to the high chance that they are playing Hela. You don't have any counters for her other than purely good luck. Let's talk about card alternatives. Good replacements for cards in this deck would be Jeff if you have him, simply because he works great with lockdown cards and can be a sort of last resort location flipper. I do not have Jeff yet, so that is why I don't already have him as part of this deck. You could also replace Sentinel with Lizard, but I prefer Sentinel simply because he gives me more 3-power cards to play. Juggernaut would also be a suitable replacement for Scarlet Witch due to his synergy with Storm and Nebula. Magneto is also a suitable replacement for Gamora in my opinion. Let's talk about when you should be snapping. I would not snap earlier than turn 4 unless you are sure you are playing against a deck type that you can counter with ease, and if you have your win condition cards in hand or in play. These win condition cards are Nebula, Storm, Spider-Man, Professor X, and Doctor Doom. I typically wait a few turns to feel out the opponent's deck and to see where they are playing early. Decks that do poorly against Nebula Control are move decks, destroy decks, ongoing decks, and any deck that is unable to add power to locked locations. Another factor to take into account is the location type. If you have locations that prevent play during certain turns like Kiln and Miniaturized Lab, you can almost guarantee that you will win, as this deck shines the most when able to play in locked locations. Dr. Doom gives you access to lockdown locations like Storm's flooded location, and Nebula benefits hugely from being played in a location like Miniaturized Lab on turn 1, as it guarantees she's able to build power. If you have one or more of these locations, then you can take it as a huge advantage for yourself and should consider snapping. That's it for today's video. I hope you were able to learn a thing or two about this deck, and I was super excited to share my thoughts on it. My goal with this video was to precisely share information on how to best pilot the deck, so let me know how I did in the comments below. Furthermore, if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to like and subscribe for more content, as this helps me reach more and more people. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.